Welcome to the Quarantine Coding Academy series, R is for Actuaries. Lesson 3, Creating a Document Using R Markdown. Note, all scripts and files can be found linked in the comment section below. Background, a day in the life of an actuary, aka Lesson 2 homework. Your stakeholders have requested you to analyze a mortality data set by 4 factors: valuation year, baseband, age basis, and gender. You were able to quickly perform this analysis using dplyr, ggplot2, and plotly. Now you need to summarize your findings and communicate this to your manager. You need your work to be reproducible and auditable. In order to do this, you stay in R and begin working in R Markdown. Before we begin with R Markdown, let's look at a sample solution to our Week 2 homework. This analysis was done using the tools we learned in the first 2 lessons with a couple of new concepts that we should take note of. Among them, relative path for dataset, a new geometry for heat maps with scaled colors and unscaled labels. We set our basebands to vertical axis. We summarize all our mortality tables using gather function. Before walking through this sample code, it might help to give more details around the gather function. Gather function is structured as gather and 3 arguments: key, value, and range. Key is the name you want to give to the new dataset column with all the old column names. Value is the name you want to give to the new dataset column with all the old column values. Range is a range of columns to be stacked on top of each other. In our homework example that we'll see, key is the mortality table names and value is the actual to expected values. In order to plot different levels of ggplot, we need data in log format. For an example below, we would use gather, year, sales, and range 2015 to 2016. That would take the data set on the left, which is wide format, to the data set on the right, which is long format. The wide format, years are columns next to each other. The long format, years and values are stacked on top of each other. So key is the name of the column that we want our levels to be. And that we set to year. And we have a column called year. Sales is the column we want to name for our values. And that is in the new data set called sales. We stack the range of columns 2015 and 16 on top of each other. So you see we go where originally we had the year sales as columns next to each other. Now they're just stacked on top of each other, 1 through 24. You walk through this demonstration, it should be very clear to you. It's not very complicated once you see an example. So let's look at the sample code. It's a sample code to complete our Week 2 homework. First, we import our libraries. We read our data set, and the first thing to notice is that the data set has a relative path. Before, we just saved our data set to the same directory as our script, and we just set everything to a working directory. And we still, when we open this, we're going to set working directory to our source file directory. Now you can see that there's no data set here. You can think of each week's homework as a different project at your company that is all being done on the same data set. You would want everyone to have their own copy of a large data set. But if you put each project same level as where your data set is, so project 1 or week 1, project 2 or week 2, project 3, week 3, the same level as data. Every project can be opened, set to the working directory, and use this relative file path. It'll make more sense if you take a little time and look at the script, which I have provided in the comment section. So next, what we do is we do our univariate data analysis for all 4 factors that we were requested. And we go through, and without any interaction, we just summarize each factor, and we create 2 plots. We look at the mortality ADE and the deaths. And we do that for each of the 4 factors. And you'll see that essentially it's still your ggplot object plus layers, but we've added more layers here, which, like I said, I provided the script, and it may seem like a lot at first, but if you look at it and break it down to its components, it's just adding labels that are just making our graph a little bit more robust. But a lot of them are unnecessary, but for a final document you're communicating perhaps to your boss, you might want to start using these additional layers. We put things like labels for data points, which is geom label, where our vertical axis you see is element angle equals 90 for our face bands, which have very long labels and would just clutter at the bottom of our graph if we didn't do this. We had a bar for our exposure at 3007, which is sometimes used as a standard for full credibility. We repeat this sort of mortality experience graph and deaths graph, like I said, for all 4 factors. So there's 8 graphs there. Then you start looking at your interaction and you group by multiple variables together. And in order to visualize that, we start using a heat map. And here what you'll see with our heat map is, first we're creating a variable called our ADE2. And we use this for our heat map color range because we don't want extreme values distorting our relative shading. But we use the uncapped or unadjusted value as a label so that we just get more information. So this is just a way to give you the most information possible. We personalize our color scheme here, just another layer that we didn't have to add. But I added a lot of extra layers, partially just I wanted to include this in the script that I'll make available to you, so you can just go through it yourself and you see different examples of different layers. And finally, we see where we're using our gather function. And remember, it's a nice way to have the columns kind of stacked up on top of each other, and you can see exactly, you want to gather all your 10 mortality tables. You want to stack them, in other words, so you can plot them with ggplot. And you can see exactly what your range is from 7580D to 15 DVTC. That makes that nice right there. And then underneath we have all of our graphs. So let's run this. And if we run it all, we did already set our working directory. It should run through. All of our objects. It's a good sign. Let's start looking at some of the graphs that we created. And here you see where we added the different labels. So that's really nice and very informative. Something that would be quality that we would be willing to send to our manager. And you see with the labels being made vertical, it's very easy to see what baseband range is being modeled. It's a nice graph. And then we'll make one for our deaths. We use deaths because that's really what's going to drive credibility. And if we're looking at mortality experience using our business acumen, we know what will be important isn't necessarily number of policies, but number of deaths, because that's where your credibility is driven. So bar graphs are used. Maybe your company might have a different graph that they prefer, but this is what I'm used to seeing for exposure. And again, the labels make it really nice and very informative, easy to read. Let me go through and do that for all 4 of the variables that we were asked to look at. So there's 8 graphs. And then we start looking at the interaction. So first interaction is a heat map that's weighted by number of deaths. And right away, you see that Here's where our exposure is, and it's in the top left-hand corner, which is low fade, recent valuation year. It's very easy to see patterns like this. It's also very clear that once you start looking at a lot of interactions, you get what's called the cursive dimensionality. You have a lot of sparse areas here, so you won't have much credibility. Well, even in where you have the most credibility, it's really only like 37%. And you may ask why you're getting so much exposure in one particular segment. Is that something, is there one business or one company that's providing data? Is it something to be concerned about? And with that, keep in mind sort of this is where there's not really much high credibility anywhere with this sort of, as you start getting this granular. But where the most credibility is are these graphs with age basis 1, top left-hand corner. So if you look at the actual to expected values, and you're looking for patterns, you can focus on sort of those more credible regions. And this is where you see we have a value of 233.77 here. This was one death, and you expected 1 over 233 deaths there. That's what the QX was. And this is the reason why we capped what our shading value is, because otherwise you would see this red and everything else white. And that doesn't give us much information. We want to sort of see if there's patterns here. You start to see that pattern like we did in our univariate variable analysis of decreasing mortality by increasing face. We wouldn't be able to see that if we hadn't capped our heat map here. So now that you've finished your analysis with your R script, it's time to document and communicate your results. And it's not acceptable just to send your boss your R script. So we need to create a more user-friendly and informative document. We do this using R. The final product looks like this. I'll show you here. HTML, and it could have been a Word document. I chose HTML. I think it just renders really nice. And it's basically just some analysis using our business acumen around those graphs that we saw. So we give a background about what the request was, some insight into what we saw with the different graphs, decreasing mortality with increasing face like we expect to see, the range of years we're seeing, where the min and the max are, and why maybe we're seeing some of the things that we are, and then the variables that, the graphs that support those observations and drove those observations. Like we said, so we took the graphs that we had in our R script, and this is where we use the additional tools that we've covered in the previous weeks, like grid arrange, to put it in a nice, concise manner that our boss can get what he needs to see very quickly. Again, all done in R. Then we go to our multivariate analysis, where we give some insight and some thoughts on what we saw, and this is just presenting, packaging up the graphs that we just saw in our R script. So finally, the single table comparison. So this is a nice looking document summary, and this is something that I would feel comfortable sending to my boss. So let's build it. Start with the fundamentals of building an R Markdown document. Working with R Markdown is very similar to working with our R script that we saw in lessons 1 and 2. Initial steps: first, you open your file. You're going to open a new file, and this time instead of an R script, it's in our notebook. You're going to, same thing as we did before, save it to your working directory. Then you're going to set your working directory to your source file location. So very similar to what we've done before. Once it's open, you can just look at a simplified view of Markdown. Is just looking at two different components that you're just going to go back and forth between. Two components are there's a coding, or coding an R editor and a text editor. Both of those sections have their own syntax. We already learned the basics of R syntax in our previous 2 lessons, so there's not really much more to learn here. There's always additional items that you can improve upon, but you have the basics. We can just really just copy for this project. We can copy and paste our code that we did in our R script into the snippets here as necessary. Now, creating an R Markdown document simply consists of going back and forth between these two components. The material from lessons 1 and 2 give you a solid background for working in this component. And working in this text editor can be as simple as just typing your summary if you don't want to format it. The only syntax you need is for formatting, things like bold and bullet points, things like that. Generally, you're only going to use a few formats in your day-to-day, so there's only a few that you'll need to master. Similar to the way you start most of your macros with a recorded macro, you can use a sample document as a template and just build from there. Translating from the RMD version to the HTML, if you have both, will give you a good fundamental background. And alternatively, or additionally, there's several resources available online, and you'll ultimately learn as much as you need and want. So let's go through these steps. Go to R, just like we did, do File, New File, but instead of our script like we did before, we're going to do our notebook. You're going to immediately save it to your working directory. We'll call it Final Report. Copy. We want to make the exact same report that I showed you as our analysis. So remember when we said it kind of consists of two sections. So you can see here's your this is your header, but after that it's just text editor, R. Text editor, if you want to add more R. Text editor, you're just going back and forth between these, and you can just see where it's marked with this these 3 tick marks and the R in the brackets. That's where you're coding, and outside of that is just where you're doing your text editor. And you're just bouncing back and forth between these. You don't need to make it any more complicated than that. So you look now, we have our Markdown file saved to our working directory. So let's start creating our final document that we want for our analysis. So the first thing we want to do is update our title in the YAML section. YAML is yet another Markdown language. It's just your header section. And we want to update our title and then clear everything out in the body. Then we'll insert an R code snippet, which we can use the insert dropdown in our studio, makes it nice. And we're just going to put our data prep from our R script, from the homework we did. So everything except for plotting our graphs. And we're going to knit that to a PDF, and we're going to have a look. And what we'll see is that we're going to need to go back and do a little bit of cleanup. So let's go through and do that. So we go through. Go to our document, our working document, and we will add our title, which is mortality. We're doing this in the header section. And this is really the only portion that you have to update that is not just bouncing back and forth between these text editor and R coding. So then just clear everything else out underneath the header. Start with a blank slate. And the first thing we want to do is start with an R script. So you can always find a drop down in R Studio to do just about anything you need. Insert R. There's a shortcut to do that, but this is good for starting. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take our homework. This is all our data prep and libraries that we're reading in. We're just going to put that in here and save that. And we're going to see what that HTML looks like. So we knit and we preview HTML. And we open it, we see that this doesn't look at all like what final document we want to create for our bosses. It has a lot of code, a lot of nonsense that would just be confusing to our stakeholders. So this is not acceptable. So what you have to do is you have to put in, just set your global options. And this is just something that for every document that you do, you just have to set certain global options to keep your document clean. And that means just, I don't want any warning messages. I don't want to see any, any sort of those footnotes or anything like that when I run. I just want my text and my plots. That's it. So in order to do that, we're going to set our global options. And that's done in another R snippet. And you can just always copy and paste that at the beginning of any R script that you, or any R Markdown that you do. So we're going to insert another R. We're going to paste that at the beginning there. Paste that here. We'll save that. Now let's knit to, and this is where you could choose between Word, PDF, and HTML. I'm just choosing HTML. I think that renders the nicest. If your boss is used to Word or something else, you can always choose that. Wait for it to render. This is better. We don't have any of the code that our boss doesn't need to see, and any of the warning messages, any of that. So this is a good start. Now we can begin putting in our text. So you can see we just have our snippets so far. Now let's add some text. So when we add text, this is our introduction to Markdown syntax, which we haven't seen. You don't need to memorize the syntax. You can use a template like this document that you have, or when you open up a new R Markdown document, you can use that. You know, it's like I said, similar to recording a macro and starting there. What we'll do is we'll add some text and we'll see some of the different syntax in this example. And you'll also see once we have this text that our document is starting to take shape. You're only going to need to, as you create documents, there's going to be certain syntax, a small percentage, just like with dplyr, just like with ggplot, that your company uses, that you use. You'll get familiar with those very quickly. And then as you want to expand upon that, Google is very nice, very helpful. There's no shame in using Google with open source. That's actually a strong part of the community. So I sometimes say that for our studio, this should just be Stack Overflow because I'm Googling so often. So no shame in Googling. So let's see what this looks like. We want to add some text here. So we'll go to the document that we already created, and we'll use that as an example. Once we have all of our initial data prep, we put in some text here. And if we just put this text section into our new document that we're creating, and that's all we add. Save that. See what that looks like with an HTML. And when you have it, this is in a window in R. Nice to open it in a browser. When I open it in Chrome, I like the 150%. I think that's the best. So now we have our title, and we have some formatted text here, and it's starting to look like the document that we saw. And you could look here, see we already saw our document. We have some bullets. We have some bolded, different levels of bolding. And you could look in your script and see where, okay, this is bolding. Okay, this is a header. This is bullet points. And you can use this, or you can Google it and get it. And either way, but you start to understand some of the syntax, and just, for me, really bolding and bullets are just about everything I need. Okay, so now we're starting to create. So we have our first example of text. Now let's add our first graph. So remember, like when we looked at the graph, I mentioned we use grid arrange, which I mentioned, I showed you in week 2. And that's what helps to make our graphs look nice. It probably didn't make much sense why I was using that before we started using Markdown, but now when you see how nice it renders, it makes a little bit more sense. And rendering our graphs and using grid arranges is done with another code snippet. So just going all the way through is just going to be alternating between text and code snippets. And once you're complete, you've done this. Now using only R, we've gone from our raw data set with 1.4 million rows of data. We cleaned and summarized our data as requested. We used this summarized data to create a visualization for our analysis, documented our findings in an HTML document that we created for our manager, and we saved an RMD file, a file that contains the entire process for our stakeholders to review. So we would continue just adding. Now our next step would be, we put grid arrange for our graphs, and then you have more text, and then you add another graph in your snippet. And so you're just bouncing back and forth with your text editor and code snippets showing your graph. I'll make this file available, so really the best way to grasp it isn't to just listen to a video for half an hour. It's that, but then you're going to want to walk through it, and even tearing it down and building your own, and it'll quickly make sense because there's only a few more concepts on top of what we've done at week 1 and 2 to get this. All we're doing, you don't need to learn Markdown, learn, how everything about Markdown. You just need to learn what part of it you need to complete your tasks. You start to see the power of R and R Markdown. You'll want to learn more, and you'll get better with practice and with just curiosity. But that's all you're doing back and forth. Here you see is just bouncing back and forth between, which has the Markdown syntax, and R snippets, which have your R syntax. And once you have this done, you knit it, and each time you knit it to HTML, what you'll see in your document, in your working directory, you're creating an HTML file, and that's what you'll ultimately send to your boss. We have final report copy, which we're working towards. You'll see that we have the RMD file, which creates it, and the HTML file, which is your output. So you would send the HTML file, the final report, to your boss. It's just a nice summary with graphs, and you can make as elaborate graphs as you want. You can put Plotly in here. You'll get your tooltips. I use labels instead. And for auditors, you can send them your RMD file. So if PIA has any question about that, they can see self-contained here, even though, because we turned our global options not to show anything, we have all of our code that supports it, how we went. Literally with this code, it's showing how we started with the raw data set and every step of the way to what we ultimately showed our boss. So if there are any questions there, or if we want to make it, we can make it available for peer review. There's nothing that is full transparency with this method. So like I said, just using R, we've been able to complete going from raw data to a really polished report. Next week, we're going to complete the series with an introduction to R Shiny, which in my opinion, is the best lesson of all. So no homework for this lesson. There's a lot to review and to take in, but then next week we will use all of these tools to really, and will enhance it a lot by building an interactive dashboard using R Shiny. So thank you.